Classification. Learning competencies. In 5.1, we will be learning about the need for classification, how to define a species. We're going to be learning about the system of binomial nomenclature and who developed it. We're also going to be explaining how organisms are given scientific names. We'll also be looking into how to write scientific names properly, and we're going to go through a few examples. We will also classify some common plants and animals, including humans, and use their scientific names. In 5.2, the 5 kingdoms, we're going to be learning about the 5-kingdom classification system. We're going to describe those 5 kingdoms and give examples for each. We are going to look into the kingdom Plantae and explain the major divisions and look at a few examples. We will classify angiosperms and the monocots and into monocots and dicots and explain what those categories are. We're also going to look in the kingdom of animals and explain the major phyla and go through a few examples of those. We'll also look into how animals are classified into vertebrates and invertebrates and explain differences between those two. Chapter 5.1, Principles of Classification. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the need for classification, define species as a group of individuals able to breed successfully with one another, describe the system of binomial nomenclature developed by Linnaeus, explain how organisms are given scientific names, write scientific names properly and give examples, classify some common plants and animals, including humans, using their scientific names. Okay, so why is it important to classify? So in this, on Earth today, there's many living things, right? And there's a lot of variety in these living things, and that variety is what we call biodiversity. And for us, it's quite complex to study this huge variety of living things. So we scientists put them into groups, and this grouping system is known as classification. And biologists do it for a few reasons. One is to help them out, to make it simple and bring some order in the chaos and confusion of all of these millions of living things in the world. And also, scientists have used classification over the years to help understand how life originated. So, what is a species? Classifying living organisms is central to understanding the variety of life on Earth. Scientists group organisms together in different ways, and as you're going to see in the rest of this chapter. But the most important unit of classification is the species. Species are defined to us in many different ways, but a common way and that's widely used is this definition: a group of organisms that can breed successfully with one another to produce fertile offspring. So, for example, horses and donkeys look similar and they can breed with one another, but the offspring produced from a horse and a donkey, known as a mule, and as you can see here in this image, these guys are sterile, meaning that they are not fertile and they cannot produce offspring. So, this is not going to result in a new species because they are not fertile. So this definition here is really important. Here's a video that goes into a little bit more detail about why mules can't have babies. Living things are classified into just how similar they are. It's as simple as that. And scientists use similarities on or in bodies to group them. So one example is animals that are put into groups together because their limbs are built on the same basic plane. So the limbs of a bat, horse, bird, human, and whale all have the same pattern, although they're used in very different ways. The front limbs of a bat are adapted for wings, and the limbs of a horse for galloping, and so forth. In a whale, the front limbs are used for swimming, and each of the animals look very different, of course, yes, but if we look at their skeletons, the bones on the front limbs are usually recognizably the same, and these are called homologous structure. Homo, usually meaning the same, and homologous, so they're the same structure. They all have what's called pentadactyl limb pattern, or a 5-digit plan. So, originally things were classified this way, just based on the physical appearance or the morphology of the organism. Classification was based on just how different or similar these things looked. And in many cases, just by looking at an organism, you could generally tell if things are related. But today, there's a much more sophisticated way of comparing organisms. The fundamental chemicals of life, like DNA, RNA, and proteins, are all found in organisms. However, while these chemicals are broadly similar across the species, we can find differences in these molecules broken down into their constituent parts. And sometimes scientists use these differences to determine which group that different species belong to. The classification system, okay, so the process that scientists use to classify living organisms and put them into groups is called taxonomy. And we use the main categories that we use here are the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The species is the smallest unit of classification. There's many different organisms in a particular phylum, and often there will be far fewer organisms in a genus, but they can have a lot of features in common. A species only contains one type of organism. All right, so the groups, these groups here, they're all called taxa. And species is the smallest unit, there's only one in there. Here's a bit of an example. So these here are different kingdoms, fungi, plants, animals. Here we're looking at a human and a honeybee. They are both in the kingdom animals, they're both animals, but they're in a different phylum, Arthropoda versus Chordata. So the human belongs to Chordata, it has got a backbone, and it's a mammal. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about how this all works in just a moment. But for now, remember that definition of species. A species is a group of organisms that can breed successfully with one another and produce fertile offspring. That's a really important thing to distinguish. The morphology. Remember when I was talking about the physical appearance? That is the morphology of an organism. And taxonomy, this is a category in classification. Now, this guy, his name is Carl Linnaeus. And in Ethiopia alone, right, we've got 85 living languages. And throughout the world, there's many, many, many languages. Many of us speak one or more languages, often including English. And all of the different languages that we have different names for animals and plants. I'll give you an example. The Ethiopian wolf is also known as the Abyssinian wolf, Saiman fox, Ethiopian jackal, red jackal, and Saiman jackal in English. As Kui Kebro in Amharic, and Jadala Dima in Afan Oromo, and Keyi Wakara in Tigrina. It's also named differently in other Ethiopian languages. Around the world, also, there's other languages, English, French, Russian, and Chinese, and they all may have different names for this fox. So, how do scientists know what species that everyone's talking about? Well, this problem's solved because of this guy, Carl Linnaeus. So, he realized this is was a problem, but before he came around, there was this other guy that actually was sort of started taxonomy called Aristotle. He's a philosopher. Back in around 380 BC, he tried to create a classification system and grouped animals such as those that live on land and others that live on water. And he thought that some of these animals, like humans, were right up the very top. He tried to give everything a scientific name with two parts, and he called this the rational animals. But his system was never finished. Then this guy came along, Carl Linnaeus. He's the guy that you need to know about. He loved to collect plants, and he was even qualified as a doctor. And he developed this system, the binomial nomenclature system. Okay, so this is back in the 18th century. He suggested ways of organizing living systems from the kingdom downwards, like in that system that we saw before, ending up with the species in the binomial system for classification, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. Basically, he wanted to use Latin because it was spoken everywhere in the world, and it was the language of scholars everywhere. And he wanted this to be used more consistently everywhere. So binomial nomenclature means it's a two-name system of naming. And this is one example, Homo sapiens. All of the species have got two names. Summary. In this section, what we've learned is scientists classify organisms to make the living world easier to understand. A species is a group of living organisms that are able to breed successfully with one another and produce fertile offspring. Taxonomy involves dividing living organisms into smaller and smaller groups based on features they have in common. The binomial system of nomenclature was developed by Carl Linnaeus, and you can classify living organisms using simple keys. Chapter 5.2 The Five Kingdoms. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the five kingdom classification system, describe the kingdoms of the Monera, Protista, and Fungi, and give examples of organisms from each one. Describe the kingdom Plantae and explain its major divisions, giving examples. Classify angiosperms into monocots and dicots and explain the differences between them. Describe the kingdom Animalia and explain its major phyla, giving examples. Group animals into vertebrates and invertebrates and explain the differences between them. Classify the vertebrates into 5 classes and give examples of each. As you learned in the previous section, the system that scientists use for classifying living things is known as the natural classification system. Living things are put into groups called taxa, based on their similarities and differences. The main taxa are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay, so you're going to have a look at some of these taxonomic groups in more detail and learn the main characteristics of our classification system. So what's a kingdom? Well, it is the largest taxon and consists of all the other taxa. In modern classification, there are 5 kingdoms, namely Monera, which are the bacteria, Protista, fungi, plants, and animals. This system is known as the 5 classification system. Once again, Monera, Protista, fungi, plants, and animals. Here's a short video that explains the 5 kingdoms of classification. The Monera include all of the bacteria and also blue-green algae. And the members of this kingdom are all single-celled organisms that do not have a nucleus. Really important to remember. These are known as prokaryotic. Pro meaning before, karyotic, this is the nucleus, or comes from the word kernel, before the nucleus. So they have no separate nucleus. Some of these can photosynthesize and make their own sugars, and others are disease-causing and known as pathogens. The Protista are microscopic, single-celled organisms that also do not have a nucleus. They are eukaryotic cells and can be quite complex in their shapes. So they include plant-like organisms, and also they have got some that move around like animal-like organisms, and some of them can't move. Actually makes up much of the plankton that's found in the oceans, which create the basis of the food supply for a lot of the organisms in the sea. Some Protista cause serious damage as well to human beings. So a lot of protists can also cause diseases. Dinoflagellates are protists that cause bioluminescence in the seas and oceans when they produce a greenish light. Okay, it's time for a few key terms. Prokaryotic cells, these are the ones that are single-celled organisms without a separate nucleus. Eukaryotic cells, they are single-celled organisms with a nucleus. Okay, so the protists, just going back here, the protists do have a nucleus, they're eukaryotic, and the bacteria, or the Monera, they do not have a nucleus, and they are known as prokaryotics, before the nucleus. Fungi. For many years, fungi were classified as a kind of plant. And a lot of people think of them as plants, but they can't make their own food by photosynthesis. Therefore, they do not really fit into the kingdom of plants. Now, the great differences between fungi and true plants are recognized. The fungi have a kingdom of their own. It's a very big group with over 80,000 species, varying in size from some very small, microscopic, single-celled organisms in the kingdom called yeasts, right up to some enormous, huge structures that are some of the biggest living things on the world. Okay, these are eukaryotic, so they have got a true nucleus, and usually they are multicellular, but the yeasts, for example, are single-celled, so it's not always multicellular. they are something called heterotrophs, meaning they absorb nutrients directly from their food. Many fungi are sapotrophs, so they feed on dead material. They play a really important role in as decomposers by feeding on dead material. And some of them can be parasites, so they can cause harm to the host, whereas others are mutualists, so they live in close association with another organism and they both benefit from it. So that's known as a mutualistic relationship. You'll be filling out this table and looking at the different types of characteristics of different kingdoms that we have just talked about, and this table and activity can be found at page 180 of your textbook. Okay, it's time for a few key terms. Mutualists. These are the associations that when both benefit between two organisms and they live in close association with each other. Mycorrhizae is the association between a fungus and the roots of a plant. And an example of this is lichens, and they are a combination of fungus and green algae or blue-green bacteria, and the mycorrhizae in there as well is another example of a mutualism. Okay, we're now on to the kingdom of plants. Plants, this kingdom is huge. There are over 300,000 species, okay? And they range from tiny, tiny mosses to giant trees. Over 80% of these are actually flowering plants. Let's look at the main characteristics of plants. This kingdom is super important. They provide oxygen for us, and we use them for medicine, building materials, and many other things. But how do we classify what is a plant and what isn't? We learnt before that fungi isn't a plant. A big important part of something being a plant is the fact that it can photosynthesize, meaning it can create its own energy from the sun. Multicellular, so most plants have got multicellular, and they are eukaryotic. They've got a true nucleus. They are usually land-dwelling, but not always. Seagrass is an example of a flowering plant that actually lives underwater. They have a waxy cuticle layer, which helps prevent the moisture leaving from their leaves and gives them protection and helps prevent them from drying out. We're now going to look at a few different types of divisions of the plants. So they can be divided into different types based on some of these characteristics. So this first one we're going to talk about is the Bryophyta. These are what are commonly referred to as the mosses and also liverworts. So the important thing about these is they are simple and they do not have a true root system. So they can't reach water under the soil or anchor themselves firmly on the ground. They're also non-vascular, meaning they don't have a transport system for food and water. They are small. Most of them live in rainforests. And just go back to this one. Here's an example of a type of moss. And you can see there they've got very simple leaves and doesn't have any roots. And you can imagine seeing something like this in a rainforest. Okay, the next division we're going to be talking about is Pteridophyta. And these are the plants which do have true leaves, stems and roots, the fern stems have these things called rhizomes, okay? These what grow horizontally just below the surface of the soil, and their stems contain vascular tissue, so they can transport food and also transport water around. They produce spore-forming bodies, which are dispersed by the wind, and they rely on water for reproduction, so that still limits where they can live. They often are found in damp, shady places, also usually in the rainforest, but we do have them here in Ethiopia too. One is the fern that is known as Bryophyta concolor. It was actually recently discovered here in Ethiopia. Spermatophytes. We're on to another division, and these are more commonly known as conifers or naked seed plants. So why are they called that? If you have a look here, you've got the pine trees, and they have got seeds that are not enclosed in fruits. They grow all around the world. About actually 1/3 of the world's forests are contain these, and they're cultivated for timber often, and they're relatively fast growing. That's why they're good for timber. They're usually the dominant vegetation in many cold and mountainous regions, and they develop relatively fleshy tissue around the seeds, as you can see in this one here. You see that fleshy tissue around there, but it's not fruit. Okay, these are considered actually some of the most successful land plants. Why is that? Well, they've got these developed roots, stems and leaves. They can get nutrients and water out of the soil. They can transport it around the plant itself, and they've got those leaves which they can use for photosynthesis. Vascular tissues relates to the tissues that they transport substances around the plant. Male gametes contained in pollen grains. Okay, so the gametes are the male reproductive materials, and they are contained as pollen, and this is what they use to fertilize other plants. The female gametes are contained within the embryo sac in the central part of the flower. Fertilization product is a seed that may become a fruit. So there's actually a couple of divisions within the division Gymnosperms. The first one is actually the biggest group of land plants, and these are known as the Angiosperms. And there's two main classes according to the number of cotyledons they have in their seeds. And so they're divided into monocots and dicots. So Gymnosperms, they are naked seed plants. Okay, that's what gymnosperm means. And often they are pine trees, spruces, and cedars. They're all commonly in the same types. They've got these characteristics we mentioned before. They're not enclosed, the seeds are not enclosed in the fruits, and they have small needle-shaped leaves, thick waxy leaves for reducing the amount of water that's lost, evergreen, so they're constantly growing the leaves, and the reproductive structures are found in these cones.